One day, Peppa and George noticed something strange in their house. In the hallway, right between the staircase and the kitchen door, a red door had appeared. No one had ever seen it before. It looked alien, out of place. The wooden boards around it seemed darker, as if the door itself had grown out of the wall, breaking through it. "George, look," Peppa whispered. Her brother only nodded. His toy dinosaur slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Curiosity got the better of her. Peppa reached out for the handle. It was cold, almost metallic, though it looked wooden. The door creaked open with a long, dragging sound. A wave of musty, damp air escaped, as if no life had been inside for decades. Behind the door was a room, empty. The grey-green walls were peeling, and the ceiling was blotched with mold. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of rot and age. "There shouldn't be a room here," Peppa said softly. They stepped inside. The very moment they did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The echo rolled through the walls. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. Peppa clutched her brother. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then came the breathing, heavy, hollow. It couldn't belong to a person, nor to an animal. It felt like the air itself was being dragged in and pushed out in the darkness. From deep within, two red lights appeared. Eyes? They drew closer, slowly, steadily. At first, there was only a shadow, but then the entire creature emerged. It was enormous, so tall its head nearly touched the ceiling. It had wings made of smoke and shadow, stretching wide and scraping against the walls as it moved. The creature advanced on the children. Its jaws opened and a low growl echoed out, sending chills racing down Peppa's back. They pressed tightly against each other. "Ma! Ma!" George whimpered softly. And then Peppa felt a touch. Something soft and familiar brushed against her paw. She looked down. It was Labubu. Her favorite toy was sitting right at her feet. Only now, he looked different. His eyes glowed with a red light, and his smile stretched far too wide, as if his face had split in half. Labubu began to rise into the air. His tiny hands stretched toward the creature. The monster growled louder, stepping back. It seemed almost afraid of the little toy. Labubu floated higher, his eyes burning like coals. The room grew hot, the air trembling. Then he darted forward, straight into the creature's chest. A piercing scream filled the room, unlike any sound the children had ever heard. Red light flooded the space, burning against the walls as though they were aflame. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut and held George tightly. When the light faded, silence fell. The creature was gone. The room was empty again. Only Labubu lay on the floor. His eyes no longer glowed. His smile had returned to its ordinary shape. Behind them, the door creaked open slowly. A cold draft brushed their backs. Without a word, Peppa grabbed George's paw and they ran out of the room. They didn't look back until they were safely in their hallway again. The red door was still there, but now it looked different. Faded, old, as though no one had touched it for centuries. The children stood there, gasping for breath. George clutched his dinosaur, and Peppa stared at Labubu, whom she had been holding all this time without even realizing. The toy looked normal again, but Peppa knew now. He wasn't just a toy, and the room beyond the door wasn't just an empty space. They never mentioned the door to their parents again, but deep inside, both of them understood. The door could return, and with it, whatever hid in the dark, and Labubu, he would always be there. And now they no longer knew. Was he their protector or a new threat? It all started the day Peppa found a strange toy in her room. It was a Labubu, a small yellow monster with big black eyes and sharp teeth. Peppa couldn't remember where it came from. "What a cute toy! Where did you come from, little one?" she asked. Labubu remained silent, but his black eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. That same day, a second window appeared in her room. The new window was old and dark, completely different from Peppa's usual window. Through the murky glass, instead of the familiar yard, there was a view of a gloomy, foggy forest. And strangest of all, in the forest grew trees that looked exactly like Labubu toys. "Mummy, look at this window and this strange forest," Peppa called out. But Mummy Pig replied, "Peppa dear, there's only one window in your room. And what's that toy you're holding?" Mummy couldn't see the second window, but even stranger, she couldn't see the Labubu toy either, even though Peppa was holding it right in front of her. On the first night, Peppa placed Labubu on her bedside table and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound, the quiet grinding of teeth. In a quiet, creaky voice, Labubu whispered, "Peppa, Peppa, look out the window." You can talk," Peppa gasped. She turned to the second window. In the forest, she saw hundreds of small yellow figures, exactly like her toy. They stood between the trees, staring directly at her. Every night, the army of toy Labubus in the forest grew larger. They moved closer to the window, and their black eyes glowed in the darkness like little stars. "We've come for you, Peppa. You found us. Now we'll find you," Labubu said. "What do you want from me?" Peppa asked fearfully. "We want you to become one of us, forever," came the chilling reply. On the third night, Peppa woke up to find her hands had turned yellow, like Labubu's, and her eyes in the mirror seemed bigger and blacker than usual. "What's happening to me?" she cried. "You're becoming one of us. Soon you'll be able to live in our forest and we'll play forever," Labubu explained with a sinister smile. Peppa tried to throw away the Labubu toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see Labubu or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the Labubu army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as Labubu's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like Labubu's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the Labubu forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow Labubu toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like Labubu winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm Labubu, and soon you'll be Labubu too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with Labubu's horrifying smile. Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy. Peppa Pig, the White Wolf and Evie. A sense of unease settled over the pig household, something that no one dared to speak aloud. It all started subtly. The first few nights, Peppa would wake up to a strange sound. Maybe the wind was rustling in the trees, or perhaps claws were scraping across the floor. When she opened her eyes, it seemed like a shadow was moving in the corner of the room. But as soon as she blinked, the shadow was gone. One night, Peppa woke up with a sense of cold. Moonlight streamed through the window, and she saw it clearly for the first time. The white wolf. He stood still, head held high, his fur glowing in the dark as if he was woven from the very light of the moon. The wolf didn't growl or move. He just stared. His breath was heavy, burning cold. The next morning, Peppa told her parents, but they just smiled and said she must have dreamed it. Mummy Pig patted her on the head and said, "You were just scared of the dark." But deep inside, Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. With each passing night, the wolf's presence grew more insistent. At first, he glided across the walls as a shadow. Then his silhouette appeared by their bed. Peppa felt his breath touch her cheek. Sometimes she heard the faint sound of claws scraping the wooden floor. George would toss and turn in his sleep, mumbling, but when he woke, he couldn't remember anything. Then Peppa noticed that the wolf wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small crib by the wall where little Evie slept. Normally, the baby slept peacefully, but now she often cried in the middle of the night. Her tiny body trembled, and it seemed like she felt the presence of the wolf more than anyone. One night, Peppa saw the wolf's eyes glow red. He stood right by Evie's crib, his muzzle lowering towards her face. The baby suddenly woke up and cried, but his gaze never left her. Peppa tried to scream, but her voice stuck in her throat. She ran to her parents, but they were sleeping so deeply, as if they had been enchanted. Days passed, and Evie changed. She stopped crying at night, but that was even scarier. She lay still, her eyes wide open, and her face had turned pale, as if drained of life. When Peppa looked into her eyes, it seemed like they were empty, glassy, and the baby was staring right through her. Peppa tried to convince Mum and Dad that something was wrong, but they just shook their heads. Sometimes at night, she heard them murmuring in their sleep. The words were soft, but she could swear they were repeating the same whisper, a distant howl. "He's waiting! He's waiting!" Then came the morning that changed everything. Peppa woke up and saw that Daddy Pig's bed was empty. His glasses lay on the nightstand, and the blanket was neatly folded. On the pillow was a piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Don't search for me. I'm with him now." Mummy Pig read the note and turned pale. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply sat down on a chair and stared at the wall for a long time. George didn't understand, but Peppa felt a chill spreading inside her. That night, everything became clearer. The room was unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The moonlight shone brightly, and its light fell directly on Evie's crib. There beside her sat the white wolf. His fur shimmered and his eyes glowed with a dull red flame. But the most terrifying thing was his smile, his muzzle twisted into a cruel, inhuman grin. Peppa stared at him, unable to move. The wolf wasn't in a hurry. He just sat next to Evie, as if waiting for her turn. Then his gaze slowly shifted to Peppa. She felt her heart tighten. In that moment, she understood. He would come for her too. Peppa Pig, the Forgotten Friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, "Peppa and Lucy." Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. But the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opens.